Week 5 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few wide receivers I looked at off the wire this week. The first receiver, Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers, out there in 60% of fantasy leagues. I know he has a bye week coming up here in week 5, but he came off a monster game at the Dallas Cowboys. Even though if you're versing the Cowboys and you got a player of those teams versing them that week, you put in your players versus one of the worst defenses, if not the worst defense in all the NFL. So Dobbs now with Jaden Reed, we know he's been out the last few weeks, still going to be out to week 9, week 10 most likely is Jaden Reed. And Dobbs has 2 double-digit fantasy games in the last 3 games. Week 2 versus the Commanders, 3 catches, 28 yards, a touchdown. Week 3 at Cleveland, 2 catches, 25 yards. And week 4 at the Cowboys, like I said, the hat trick, 6 for 58. And 3 touchdowns on 8 targets. So week 6, another good matchup after the bye coming up for this Packer team versus Cincinnati, a defense that can't stop anyone. And they just got embarrassed in week 4 by the Denver Broncos. Yeah, I know this football gets spread out all over the field by Jordan Love, where every week it's somewhat different in this offense for the Packers. But Romeo Doubs, in terms of the receiving room, has been the more consistent guy this season so far, even over Matthew Golden. And worked it this week. Next receiver, Hollywood Brown of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Brown, after one down game, he got dropped in 15% of fantasy leagues. And now he made the list once again available in 56% of leagues. So Brown, so far this season, 2 solid games and 2 down games for Brown. Week 2 versus Philly, 5 for 30. Week 3 at the Giants, 4 for 42. And week 4 versus the Ravens, 3 for 38 and a touchdown. So I know Xavier Worthy, he returned in last week's ball game. He looked good for this Kansas City Chiefs team. And now week 5 on Monday night, it's a good matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So they still need that number 2 target in the receiving room. Travis Kelce, I think, is about a year behind him. The numbers really haven't been there. And Hollywood Brown, he still could create separation, get open, and make plays. And like I said, in week 4, we saw that a little bit for Hollywood, where he found the end zone in that ball game. So definitely a receiver to add this week. The next wideout, Alec Ayomaner of the Tennessee Titans. So Ayomaner, he's been on the list majority of the season as well in the early going, and he just had a down game where this Tennessee Titan team couldn't move the football at all at the Houston Texans. So Ayomaner, the last few weeks for him as well, he had 2 double-digit games in a row. Week 2 versus the Rams, 4 for 56, a touchdown. Week 3 versus Indianapolis, 4 for 38, a touchdown. And then, like I said, week 4, Houston, only 2 for 44, but the targets have been there for Ayomaner. Over the last 3 games, for him, 18 targets. That's solid, 6 targets per game. And he's out there in tons of fantasy leagues. And Calvin Ridley hasn't done much at all this season, where Ayomaner's outplayed him for sure in the early going. So right now, well, he's playing decent football, even though it was a bad game, but a decent matchup coming up at Arizona in week 5. 9th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. He's out there in 69% of fantasy leagues. Next receiver, Marvin Mims of the Denver Broncos. So this possibly could be the breakout year here for Marvin Mims. Consistencies have been a problem, but he had a big ball game in week 4 versus Cincinnati Bengals, 6 for 69, and a nice end-around trick play on a 16-yard touchdown for Marvin Mims. So this receiving room, besides Cortland Sutton, I don't know if it's going to be Mims or Troy Franklin weekly, but like I said, coming off a good game and very featured in the offense was Mims, even though Bo Nix was spreading that football out and could do whatever he wanted versus a bad Cincinnati defense in the week 4 blowout victory on Monday night. I think Marvin Mims, a guy out there in tons of fantasy leagues in 76%, is worth an ad this week, especially where there's a lot of injuries at receiver. Malik Neighbors out for the year, tore the ACL. Tyreek Hill, dislocated knee. It wouldn't be surprising if he's out for the year as well. So a lot of teams losing these 2 big guys, obviously, and they need receiving help. And this week, I think there's intriguing options and obviously fill-in options. And the next receiver is a fill-in option, Malik Washington of the Miami Dolphins. So like I said, Tyreek Hill, dislocated knee. It didn't look good. It bent right away after he made a catch in the 3rd quarter on the sidelines. Malik Washington, he was in this offense a little bit as a gadget guy and a trickery play guy. So he's going to have that role, but obviously more receptions and targets are going to come his way as well for Washington. So the last few weeks, week 2 versus the Pats, 3 carries, 23 yards, a catch, 2 yards, including a return touchdown. Week 3 at Buffalo, 2 carries, 20 yards, 3 catches, 12 yards. And then week 4 versus the Jets, he didn't do much. 2 carries, 8 yards, 2 catches, 13 yards. So like I said, they use him on jet sweeps. They use him on end around and trickery plays, and he's a return man as well. But Malik Washington, he's going to get more opportunity, I believe, in this offense. Like I said, 8 to 12 targets a game is now available, even though we saw Darren Waller broke out. Well, I'm going to talk about him, obviously, in the tight end video. But Malik Washington, he's going to be in the receiving room. He's either going to be the number 2 guy now or the 3 guy gadget once again. But like I said, someone definitely to go out there in deep leagues, out there in 96% of fantasy leagues. Next receiver staying with the same team, Nick Westbrook-Akine of the Miami Dolphins. He's more obviously the traditional wide receiver that's going to line up. And now obviously with Tyreek Hill out of while of the season, I think Westbrook-Akine is going to get more snaps and more action for this Miami Dolphin team. Where, like I said, Malik Washington, he's been more of a gadget guy and big play type of guy at times for this Miami Dolphin team. So far, Westbrook-Akine, like I said, we haven't seen much from him, but he's more a traditional wide receiver that'll line up on the outside, where Washington is obviously a slot guy, even though McDaniel likes using a lot of speed in the offense. So Westbrook-Akine, week 2 versus New England, 2 catches, 18 yards, 3 targets. Week 3 in Buffalo, didn't do anything. And week 4 versus the Jets, 1 catch, 1 yard. So I know he's a deeper league ad, is Westbrook-Akine, but like I said, last season, he went out there in limited time and had a nice year in terms of catching touchdowns. 32 catches, 497 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns on 60 targets. I think he's going to be used in this offense as Westbrook-Akine. And now with Tyreek Hill out, we'll see if it's him or Washington at that wide receiver 2 position. And he's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. Next receiver, Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys. So Tolbert, the last couple of years, he's been solid, especially in PPR leagues. He's a guy that'll score you 9, 12 fantasy points. Him and Dak have a good rapport. We know CeeDee Lamb, he's out at least another 2-3 weeks with the high ankle sprain. George Pickens stepped in very good for that number 1 wide receiver role, going over 130 yards and scoring 2 touchdowns. And Jalen Tolbert, he had a big catch where Dak was on the run and he threw it to the sidelines and he came back in and caught the football. So the last couple weeks with expanded role, week 3, Chicago, 3 catches, 24 yards, 2-point conversion, 6 targets. And week 4 versus Green Bay, 4 for 61 on 6 targets. So week 5, a good matchup at the New York Jets. 11th most fantasy points to receivers on the year. We know the Jets defense can't stop anyone. And I think this could be another shootout where Dallas, we've seen 2 of them already. Week 2, winning in overtime 40-37. And then last week, 40-40 tie in that one. So week 5 in New York, I think Tolbert could go out there and be a viable option for owners out there in 96% of fantasy leagues. And the final receiver, Darius Slayton of the New York Giants. So like I said early in the video, Malik Neighbors out for the season, tearing that ACL, getting carted off, and then Darius Slayton stepping in to the role. And he's a veteran. It just seems like every season he finds a way to get on the field for this Giant team. So like I said, if the Neighbors went out, 3 catches, 44 yards in that one, it was for Slayton. And the last 3 games, he's actually had 7 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. And now with an expanded role the rest of the season and a good matchup at New Orleans, I like Slayton even in your basic 12-team leagues. Out there in 98% of fantasy leagues, Jackson Dart's going to need a veteran to lean on, and Darius Slayton's going to be that veteran wide receiver. Week 2 with Dallas, 2 catches, 61 yards. Week 3 versus the Chiefs, 4 for 30 on 4 targets. And week 4, like I said, versus the Chargers, 3 for 44. So now with an expanded role and a young quarterback that's going to rely on veterans, and Slayton, one of the only veterans in this offense, he's definitely an ad this week, available in 98% of fantasy leagues. That's a few receivers I looked at off the wire for week 5 of the fantasy football season.